Support for the Nonprofit Lab comes from courage, the ability to do something that frightens you. Courage. Find mental or moral strength to venture, persevere, and withstand danger, fear, or difficulty for what you believe in. Welcome to the Nonprofit Lab, a podcast dedicated to the ongoing discovery of how we can all be a part of bigger social change through the lens of the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Puya Porak. I'm an industrial engineer, human-centered designer, and CEO of Match Nice, a social impact tech startup with a mission to connect the nonprofit ecosystem and maximize social impact. Thanks for joining us on our startup journey as we look to uncover and shake up the status quo in the world of nonprofits. On today's episode, I have the privilege of interviewing Nisha Anand, an Indian American activist, mom of 2 teenagers, and a boundary-busting national leader for social and racial justice. Once a grassroots activist arrested in Burma for pro-democracy demonstrations, Nisha is known today as a leader in cultivating unlikely and unconventional partnerships to create change. As Dream.org's CEO, Nisha guides a team of storytellers, organizers, and policy experts working on some of society's toughest problems to create a better future for all. In this episode, we discuss why political action is so important to social change, ways to build common ground to advance missions, how nonprofits can embody inclusivity inside and out, what it looks like to partner with the people you truly serve, and challenging development and fundraising status quo practices. Here we go. Here's my conversation with Nisha. Nisha, welcome to the Nonprofit Lab. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's Friday. Can't complain.
I'm so excited about our conversation today because you embody so much of what I strive to embody in my own life with building bridges. And I think it's what we as a country and a world need so much more of. And we have quite a bit of the conversation dedicated to that topic. But before we go into that, um, let's start a little bit with your background. I know you've been a social justice activist and leader for over 20 years now. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey and how you found yourself in your seat today as the leader of Dream.org?
Sure. I think I'm going to have to update that line and say like over 30 years now. It's been a long time. And I think that with the breadth of being an activist, and being just, I often say a hellraiser, like in high school, I was down for any cause. I would be involved in anything where I thought there was an injustice. Sign me up. I would join your club. I would join your protest. I was really just passionate about any places where I could make a change. Any place where I saw injustice, I wanted it to stop. I didn't want anyone to be left out and left behind. I identified as a first-generation American growing up in the South, in Atlanta, Georgia, with immigrant parents. It was very much in the 80s a Black and white city, and still a lot of the times it is. And so I was kind of this misfit. I didn't fit in anywhere. And for me, I think I identified with that a lot. I didn't want to be left out and left behind. And so instead of being just outside of what was the norm, I decided I belonged everywhere and anywhere. And in fact, my mission became making sure everyone else was included. So my early feelings around justice was that I didn't want anyone else to feel left out or left behind. And I was going to fight for them to be included. And in that kind of 30 years of activist history, I feel like I've been on every side of what is necessary to have a healthy social change ecosystem. There are parts that everyone has to play. And I believe everyone is suited to do something to move this country forward, to have progress, and finding that place and where it is, and that you don't have to stay in the same place. You can try on a lot of different roles throughout your life and find out the ways in which you can help make the world a better place. I mean, quite honestly, I was very much a young dreamer and wanted to live a life of consequence. And so found my way through, whether it was getting arrested, in civil disobedience protest, or planning big conferences to talk about change, or working in government agencies or in a nonprofit now leadership role. I got to see all parts of that social change ecosystem.
Wow. I didn't realize that you also started out in Atlanta. So I'm also first generation American. My parents fled the Islamic Revolution in Iran, went from Japan to Dubai to Finland to Atlanta, and I grew up there and definitely kind of felt like the outsider and trying to weave into this new culture and society and everything. Curious for you, like was was that magnetism towards affecting change just something that's always been innate within you, or did that come from somewhere specific?
I don't have like an origin story that I can remember of the day that everything changed and I knew this was my path. I feel like when I look back on it, because I was like, wouldn't that be great if there was one story? My brother got picked on a lot, to tell you the truth, my older brother. I hated it. I think that is something that I remember really keenly as a young person, is just how much it felt unfair and not okay. And there was a bit of me that felt like I had to protect him. That would be the youngest time I remember. But my first organizing experience I remember was in high school. I went to a private Catholic high school in Georgia, and we had uniforms. And I would sometimes, because, I was who I was, I'd wear the boys' uniform because I wanted to be like, you can't make me wear a skirt. But also at some point as a young feminist, I decided I wasn't going to shave my legs either. And, when I was brave, I might wear a skirt, but most of the time I'd wear the boys' uniform so that, I wasn't showing off my hairy legs. But I got called into the disciplinarian's office one day, and she gave me this lecture about how it's unhygienic and we're not in Europe. And maybe this is okay in Europe, but not in America. And she said some boys were disgusted. And I was captain of the debate team, so I had a lot of big words back then, and I loved using them. And I told her something about her patriarchal assumptions of what a woman should be, and kind of threw a fit. And the next day, I started getting all of my friends to stop shaving their legs as well.
All right.
Right. So that was what I remember. The year after I graduated, they changed their dress code to make it very explicit that these things were not acceptable, what I was to do and not do. So that was the first time I remember organizing and feeling like I have some power here.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So I love that it seems like an organic evolution for you, like the origin story moniker of like getting bit by a benevolent mutant spider and turning into like the person you are. Um, but reading your profile, it seemed like one pivotal part of your activist journey was the work that you were doing in Burma. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. As a college activist, like I said, any cause that was active, I would jump on. And the other active group on my campus was the Free Burma Coalition. And the organizer of that group said, hey, next summer, I'm organizing a trip to Thailand, and we're going to learn all about the crisis there, the democratic movement. We're going to go to the border regions. We're going to go to all of this stuff. I said, sign me up. So I went with a group of people from my university, American University of Thailand. It was a pretty vanilla student activist trip. We met refugees. We met people who had fled for different reasons. We met different NGOs that were doing work to try to change the human rights situation in what we were calling at the time Burma, which other folks know as Myanmar. And it was amazing, eye-opening trip for me. But there was also this woman on the trip who asked, would any of you like to partake in a civil disobedient action that we are planning on doing inside the country? And I've already told you a little bit about who I was. I said, yes, sign me up. So did 5 Actually, it was 3 other students from American University said us too. The rest of the American University students went home. And this woman runs a organization called ALTSEAN. So it was an alternative ASEAN group that was trying to have all the ASEAN nations, which is a group of countries very much like the way we think of, you're going to have to help me because the word isn't coming to me right now, just an economic bloc of countries that do free trade with each other.
Yeah, like kind of
Anyway.
the European Union type situation.
Sure.
Yeah.
Exactly. So they put pressure on Burma to try to change their human rights situations by using some economic pressure, diplomatic pressure, whatever. A group of 18 activists she put together, all ages, from 8 different countries, to go inside Burma on the 10-year anniversary of the 88 massacre. In 1988, when there was a democratic uprising, mostly led by Burmese students inside the capital of Rangoon, calling for democracy after some elections were suppressed and leaders were locked up, about 10,000 people were murdered. And the rest fled to the border areas or fled the country. And that happened on August 8th, 1988. I was there on August 8th, 98, 10 years later. And me and this group of 18 people from around the world handed out these leaflets, and they were this big. We had to smuggle them in our shoes. We smuggled them in these bathroom bags because in a military dictatorship like Burma, every printed piece of material has to be approved by the government. They do not have newspapers. They do not have textbooks. We stayed in a foreign, I remember seeing this because I was young. It was a huge impression on me. We stayed in a hotel meant for foreigners. So they allowed international papers to come in, but they had big holes cut out in them. So you would open, and I know, from your history, you understand this type of repression. It is everywhere, and you don't notice it, and then you notice it, and it blew my mind. And so we smuggled in these leaflets, and they simply said, "We are your friends from around the world. We support your hopes for human rights and democracy." That's all it said. It wasn't like overthrow the military or anything. We support your hopes for human rights and democracy. And I somehow thought, since it was a very well-planned action, that we were all going to do our action that morning, 5 minutes. We have plane tickets back to Thailand, and we were going to get out of there. Well, all of us got arrested, which we didn't know. We were held in different groups. So I didn't know that everyone had been arrested, but I did know that the woman, Debbie, who planned this from ALTSEAN, had a very strong plan in place to call our embassies, call our families, and get us out. I look back now that my son is the same age as I was then, I cannot believe that I did that, because of course anything can happen, as you know, as anyone who has lived under these regimes knows, like they could have killed and asked questions later. Anything could have happened, but we were held for a week. We had a sham trial where we were sentenced to 5 years in hard labor, and then we were all deported. One of the biggest things, I think there are a lot of lessons I took away from that, of course, is understanding how interconnected all of our struggles are, understanding how democracy is a value. I've come to understand this a lot more now than I did then, because it didn't feel threatened in America like it does now. So I know I learned a lot about what the slow erosion of our democratic values and democratic principles can look like. When I was there, that was certainly a lesson. But one of the biggest lessons I learned was that there was a US congressman, Representative Chris Smith. He's a Republican from New Jersey, who was the head of the Human Rights Committee at that point. He flew all the way over there and was there when we were released. And I thought, the self-righteous activist I was going to sit next to him the whole way home and tell him about all the things that need to change in this world, because I knew that we had different opinions on a whole host of things. But what happened instead, he opened up the conversation on this very long flight home with other areas where he had concerns about human rights violations. And we had a lot in common. And yeah, there were some differences, but I found myself wanting to be respectful when we were talking about the differences rather than confrontational. And that was pretty new for me, being the type of oppositional on the streets, on the ground activist I was. So I think that lesson, it slowly evolved to where I am now as the CEO of dream.org.
Wow.
I know I talked a lot, huh?
No, and I say wow from a position of how just real that is, and how special that perspective is also in the position that you're in. And I was going to ask, how has your activist journey helped prepare you to lead in the current position at dream.org? But I think you've answered that question through the few examples you've already shared. And I do want to come back to this notion of bridging the divide and your story with kind of different perspectives and trying to come together. And I'll just tell you, one of the things that inspired me to want to support the nonprofit sector was really, it all kind of was born out of the massive division that was stoked and has been continually stoked between political lines, and recognizing that, wait, it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on, people in the nonprofit sector are still doing a lot of good in the world. And there's this underlying current of kindness that kind of diffuses the, forgive my language, political bullshit sometimes, that like makes us see each other as supremely different. So I want to come back to that, but let's start back at your current role at dream.org. Tell us about the mission at dream.org and the major problems that the organization or opportunities that you all are focused on addressing.
Yeah. So our kind of motto is close prison doors and open doors of opportunity. So a lot of the work that we do is in the criminal justice reform sector and in the climate justice sector, and we are very future focused. So tech is a really big piece. When we look for solutions that can solve these big problem sets, we're always going to look at technology. A lot of what we do, if you look at what we're doing day to day, if you hear about our wins, a lot of them are legislative wins. We think at scale. When we try to transform these big systems at scale, legislation is one of the best tools we have in the nonprofit world. So we do a lot to influence legislation locally, state, and federal. But if you are to say, what do you do? If you just met me at a party and say, hey, I've never heard of what you do, what do you do? I'd say, we make change. We're trying to make the biggest possible change possible for the most people possible without further dividing the country, without having to polarize anyone else. Like I told you, I was left out and left behind as a child. I do not want any solution that we put forward to create that for someone else. I believe that we can have progress without polarization. And that's what I think makes dream.org unique versus anyone else that's working on criminal justice and working on climate. All of our legislation has a bipartisan element to it. Any of our solutions, like when we're trying out new programs in the field, has what I call the biggest table of unlikely allies you can find. We want to set a big table. We want to bring people from every sector, folks who've never talked to each other before, to think about how to solve a problem, because we believe not only do you get your best solution set by having diverse voices at the table, you have durable, long-lasting solutions because the stakeholders are from all different areas. Their power comes from all different places. So I don't just think it's the right thing to do, like I don't want to leave out anyone. I also think it's the only thing that works. It's durable and it gets done. And so that's what makes us unique in terms of, we come with a very progressive lens. We don't try to hide who we are. We do care about things that you would put in those kind of lefty set of values. That's who we are. But we are going to welcome anyone who wants to work on that, regardless of what set of values you come from. That's how we learn.
And you're a profoundly effective bridge builder in that capacity. And I want to talk about the TED Talk that you took the stage for around finding radical common ground. But you mentioned one of the differentiators for dream.org is the ability to actually affect changes in policy. And this is something in my own journey of discovery in the nonprofit sector that I've seen, is that most of the sector is very much focused on the symptoms of systemic issues, and we need that level of service, but we also need more organizations focused on addressing some of the root issues, which oftentimes are tied to policies. Can you tell us about the First Step Act and the work that you did? What is that, and how did you make that come to life?
Yeah, sure. I think that what you said is really important, that every nonprofit has its own role to play, and understanding what your role is, the mission of the organization and what that role is so important. We need nonprofits to do social services, frontline, on the ground work. The government used to do that and provide that, and slowly that's been shifted to the nonprofit sector. So frontlines work is very important. And for us, the legislation piece is important, but we are a systems change organization. So for us, our legislation is really aimed at changing whole systems. So we might have a small criminal criminal justice reform bill that might look very small, but we're trying to play it towards that systems change idea. How can this one thing, for instance, one of our bills in Georgia was the Dignity for Incarcerated Women Act, and it passed unanimously in a Republican-controlled Congress. And there were small things. Making sure that women weren't shackled during childbirth, making sure they had access to any of the feminine hygiene products they need, saying guards can't watch them while they're using the bathroom, like very basic things, but it was easy, low-hanging fruit that who would oppose that? Nobody. And building that idea that we can have a unanimous vote on something like that, it's a building block to something bigger. And so I do think that for us, understanding ourselves as a systems change organization is important. And not all organizations are that way. Some are movement building organizations, and we need them. We need them to build the people and the attention and make it loud and attractive and irresistible to get more people thinking about these things, right? We all have our role. So for us, the First Step Act, and it was named the First Step Act because of that, is it was a first step. Bipartisan criminal justice reform seemed like an oxymoron before, in the 90s. I was on the streets. I actually had gotten arrested at the 2000 Republican National Convention for protesting the criminal justice system back then. So in 2000, there was not a single Republican that was on the streets with me during that convention. So to think I'm going to pass bipartisan criminal justice reform, everyone thought we were crazy. It sounded like an oxymoron, and we still did it. Because what I understood is I've always cared about the criminal justice system, because for me, I saw racism, I saw historic systemic oppression that was so all-encompassing, the school to prison pipeline, like all of that. It's a justice for me, and that's what it's always been about for me. But on the Republican side, on the right, they wanted to change the criminal justice system for very different reasons. It's a financial waste. Taxpayer dollars are going to a bigger and bigger system that gets worse results. It's inefficient, corrupt. They don't want to keep spending taxpayer dollars on it. You have the religious conservatives who believe in second chances and redemption and are usually anti-death penalty, that there are a lot of folks there that want to see reform. And you have libertarian, another big pillar of that Republican right side of things, who think it's government overreach. There are too many people inside for drug crimes. So all coming at it for different reasons, we're willing to sit at the table and say, what could we do together? And we had one big stumbling block. We started that while Obama was president. We had a lot of folks come to the table. We had this bipartisan convening on criminal justice reform, where we ended up having red state, blue state governors. Eric Holder, who was attorney general at the time, came, as well as Rick Perry, right? It was like this big, oh my gosh, this is possible moment, but we didn't pass a bill. And so when Trump was elected and we had a Republican House, Senate, and, Trump in office, we had to ask ourselves, can we still do this? And for us, the answer was, is it possible? Not, is it the right time? But a lot of our partners said, let's wait until we have better optics. If we try to push it now, we might not get everything we want, right? If it's a Republican control, they might make us take this thing we want off the table. They might make us take this thing. And that is true. That's politics. But if we waited 4 years for something to change, or 8, because obviously there's a chance Trump gets elected again, there are people inside prison who are waiting 8 years for the first step. And so we went ahead, we kept moving, and we said, what do we need to get this passed as soon as possible? And let's just lay out that this is a first step. So when you keep the mission first, like, who are the people I'm fighting for, top of mind, you just keep going. And that meant organizing the powers that be. And when that bill passed, there were 89 members of the Senate in a Republican-controlled Senate that voted yes. That's not a little bipartisanship. That is a lot of bipartisanship. That means that it won't be easily overturned, and people are trying to now. But we pushed it through, and we were told on the left, it doesn't go far enough. We were told on the right, this is like jailbreak. You're letting prisoners out, everywhere. We had people equally saying, don't do it. But now, 5 years later, we have 20,000 people home from that one piece of legislation. And so for me, when folks say, it's not possible, what can you do? Maybe I say it is possible, and the proof is later. That thing is not going to get overturned. In fact, it's hopefully just getting stronger and stronger. I mean, that's at least what we're trying to do. And other states can follow suit. That's a lot of people who get to be home, who shouldn't have been in there that long. And for me, that's enough to keep going. And folks say, oh, you did that on criminal justice, but you'll never do it on climate. I'm like, I was there when everyone told me there's no way this is happening on criminal justice. Like, I lived there. So I know it's possible. And that's what helps me keep going.
Well, it's clearly not a good bet to bet against you, Nisha. So I think, you cover some of the elements of what you just discussed in your TED Talk about, finding radical common ground. What are the strategies, the mindsets that are so important in finding this common ground? And, the way you were describing kind of the different sides of the political spectrum, their interests, their values, and kind of finding the common ground was interesting enough. But I'd love to hear you expand a little bit about how people can
Yeah.
foster this type of mindset and approach.
Well, look, on my best days, I embody it. Like you said at the beginning, you like that I embody this. On my best days, yes. But I am also human. And if you ask my children or my husband, they will tell you, oh, yeah, not always. She's not always common ground. I definitely like to get my way. And sometimes I will just keep fighting. So I want to say that it's a battle. But what I also know is just as much as I battle to get my way, all of us are born knowing how to find common ground. If you order a pizza, I'm vegetarian, let's say you're non-vegetarian, we're not going to sit here and force you. You're not going to force me to eat meat. You're going to come up with, well, maybe I can eat veg today. Maybe we can split it half and half. Maybe we can get 2 pizzas. Maybe we can there's a million ways, and we know how to do that. I don't force you to see a movie you hate. We find a movie we both like. That is something we do every day. I think we've lost track of that ability when it becomes higher stakes issues. And so for me, the next thing you have to do is be able to say, I agree on something, anything the other people say. I think that when we say, oh, they're Republican, I'm Democrat, we automatically say there's nothing we could possibly agree on. So we say no, even to things we know aren't crazy, right? I was thinking of the mask debate, and I wanted everyone to wear a mask. We had to, safety, whatever, that's how I felt. But it meant that anytime I encountered someone who was anti-mask and thought it was stupid, right? You have to be like, you're wrong, I'm right. And maybe that's the way you'll always feel. But when you listen, because I was actually, my son was on a sports team with a lot of Republican parents who were very anti-mask. In fact, at the height of the beginning of the pandemic, we were traveling to Texas because we couldn't play baseball in California. So I was with these parents, and they said, I hate it. I hate wearing it. I can't breathe. I can say, I agree. I hate wearing it. I can't breathe. But for some reason, we've said we can't admit any of that, Or my kids get pimples and they're losing their confidence. I can say, I know that totally sucks. I see it too. It's hurting their what can we do about their confidence? Find the place where you agree and say, I agree, and find it often. I think it is so important, because allowing yourself to be intellectually consistent and admit the places where they might have some right points opens up the possibility they can do the same for you. That is really important. And we do that all the time. But for some reason, when it's entered this world of politics, we just think we can't. And I keep asking my team, let's be intellectually consistent, you guys. Like, we just have to be. I think on our staff, one of the ones that I always point out is that, we work on criminal justice reform. We have a lot of formerly incarcerated leaders on staff. We have a lot of formerly incarcerated leaders in our network, and pretty much everyone is directly impacted to some extent. And we were just having this conversation about a billionaire who's recently been put in jail, and how upset they were, or Trump going to jail and how upset. And I'm like, you guys, we offer redemption to murderers. In fact, we're all sitting next to some right now. Are you saying that they can't have that? Like, let's be consistent, you guys. Like, there is just something that we have to question ourselves, and we can say, okay, that person does deserve redemption. I don't want them in the prison. I do want to call out there's a class privilege or a race privilege for that person. Just say that, right? Like, we don't have to be. And so I think that that's kind of, if I can say in my old age, being more consistent means that I get to say to someone, you're right, more often than I used to. And they'll say it back.
You're right. And I'm not even opposing what you're saying. I think what you described requires a very high degree of emotional maturity. I think you used the term of opening up the possibility for there to be common ground. And I think what you're saying is you can be the one to take that first step, and it necessarily, like you said, not every day is perfect. You may necessarily not always kind of build that bridge in that moment, but you're creating the possibility for that to happen. And I do want to come back to what you said about the populations that you're working with, your team, working with folks that are actually affected by the cause that you're working to change. But before I go there, I wanted to get your thoughts on this notion of building common ground. It's a very clear, there are so many clear examples of where it's so important for that to happen in politics, around legislation, policies. It seems like nonprofits are potentially feel like they could be a step removed from that in some cases. Where do you see the role and the responsibility and kind of like the need for nonprofits to better embrace this type of mindset, whether it's through like the people they're working with or fundraising, or just curious where you're seeing this idea of the common ground challenge needing to be embraced further in the nonprofit sector?
To some extent, the question is, how do ideas spread? How do they take hold of the imagination or become something that's irresistible or compelling, or people want to do it? And there's a lot of out there in the world. I think that when I first started, one of my early jobs, pre-kids, a while ago, I worked at the Rape Crisis Center in San Francisco. And rape crisis centers had opened up in the, a lot of them had opened up in the 60s, 70s, most of them after that. But they really were focused on what they knew. It was usually white women who were part of first wave feminism or close to it that had an idea that we need to break the silence. It was a long time. And it was actually while I was on staff where some of these rape crisis centers for the first time were trying to understand intersectionality and how rape is a very different issue in different communities and how it might not look the same in terms of healing. And that was while I was on staff in, the late 90s, early 2000, grappling with this idea. And we were one of the first rape crisis centers that transformed to be mostly women of color led. Now, I think throughout the nonprofit sector, throughout the foundation sector, everyone says, I need to understand your equity plan. How do you view equity? Is your decision-making, does it involve this intersectional approach? Are you talking, right? Like, it's there now. That was a pretty short transformation time. I mean, maybe it's a really long time when you think about history. That has to happen with polarization and democracy. We have to make it essential that put forward policies that do not hurt other people. You should get punished if you increase polarization, I think. I really do. Right now, we are on the brink of, we have felt in the last 10 years that we've been on the brink of a civil war, of losing our democracy, of electoral coup, of an actual coup. Like, the stakes are so high that we should think about, how is this next act? How's my annual plan? How is my strategic plan also decreasing polarization, also making us come back together, also helping us from making even one step further on that path to civil war. I think it's important. If we lose our democratic rights or the values that make democracy important, we lose a lot. And I know that you know that. And so for me, making the idea that bridge building should be not just irresistible. I mean, I don't know how to make it enticing. It does sound, when you talk about it, I haven't figured out the right way to talk about it because it sounds a little kumbaya and people think I'm just talking about like sitting around a campfire and singing songs or something. I don't mean that. I mean it fierce, like I'm doing this because it's the only way I can secure freedom for me and my people. I want to make that fierce desire for unity a necessary part of social change. So yeah, some evangelizing is on the horizon for everyone at dream.org as well.
And how do you take what you've done and what the team at dream.org is embracing around this topic? What are some ways that you feel like you're leading the way in this area, that maybe the nonprofit sector as a whole could learn from, or things that every nonprofit should consider? I'll just start by saying this is a topic that's come up a lot. Diversification is an important part of that, making sure that the people who are on your board are also representative of the communities that you're serving, different, backgrounds, everything. Curious to hear from you, what other ways can nonprofits think about embracing and being part of this wave of change that we so need?
I think the board is important, and we're actually in the middle of a rebuilding process too. In case anyone's listening and like what we're saying, we're going to have some open applications soon for the board, just so you know. I think leadership is really important. Who you have at the top makes all the difference. I have been in the lower hierarchies of the nonprofit organization. Of course, I had to work my way up at some point. I think that as much change as you want from the bottom, that's important. You need that change from the top. If you're in an organization you think has a long way to go in really understanding how to be representative and inclusive, I would sometimes say you have to make the decision. Do I want to fight because this is the place that needs that, or do I go somewhere else? It's hard to change organizations that have a long history, but it's necessary work. So do it because you love the organization and you want to see it transform. Don't do it just because you want to speak truth to power. I'd say that's one big lesson I've had, is that if we don't come to this sector because we want money, right? We come from what you said before. A lot of us just have these big hearts and we want to make change. And we got to remember where the protest and the fight's for and where the love and kindness is for. So if you're in an organization that needs to transform, stay there and fight for it because you love it. And that will change how you seek change within your organization, versus where I was when I was kind of young, was very much like I fight power wherever I see power, and that's within my own organization. So I think that it can come from the bottom. The top absolutely has to be reflective of the communities you serve and the change you want to see and the people that have the most voice. I think that values, organizational values, can be better used. I was very resistant to our process of defining our organizational values because I was told it would take a year. And I'm very impatient. A year sounded ridiculous. I said, look, I can rattle off 3 values for you. These are our values. But by taking a year, considering all of the possibilities, merging, unmerging, trying things out, thinking about it, by the time we settled on our 3 core values, everybody knew exactly why. Now, the whole entire staff has probably transformed since that point. There are probably only 5 or 6 of us from that era, but it lives on in such a strong way. We are evaluated. Our evaluations have the core values in them. That's number 1, what you're evaluated on. Our leadership principles, they're matched up with values. This leadership principle is our leadership principle because it embodies we only have 3: servant leadership, solutions, and soul. And soul is like, think about it, like we have it defined, but our leadership will have soul as a piece of it. So we have evaluation criteria that fits our values. I think that people can really use their values to make sure that those equity principles are right, up front. And we put it in all of our theory of change documents, right? Like, as much as we are first and foremost progressive values, we're fighting for a set of values. I'm going to draw you, for everyone listening, a Venn diagram. The first one is like progressive values. That's where we start. The second one, and you've heard me talk a lot about, is this radical inclusivity. It has to include everybody. It has to be that big bipartisan table, but that can sometimes take you off course too. So our third one that really anchors us is equity up front. And I feel like dream.org is right in the middle, that we will always come to you. You can count on us to bring that equity lens, to be radically inclusive and stick to our values. And that's kind of where I find our unique value.
Oh, so good. Also very timely. The previous episode, your episode 25, by the way, which is kind of a fun little milestone for our podcast. Episode 24 with Brenda Boyle was all about defining and living through values for organizations, and how just foundational that is, not just to the decision making that happens within a nonprofit's organization, but also in protecting your people in situations. And it's the thing that shouldn't just be painted on a wall, right? It's something that you're living day in and day out. And I think having the element of inclusivity and open-mindedness, everything that we've been talking about, as part of your value soul, and like, that's so deep, I love that, is really critical. And
Yeah.
like sage
I mean,
advice as well.
right? Think about it. We're on DC. We're having a briefing on the Hill for legislators. And I get to walk into my staff and be like, how is soul reflected in this event? Like, there's not many other DC Hill briefings where they're making sure that, like, yeah, soul's a piece of it. And so I think it just defines, your values can really help. Yeah.
And part of your values with inclusivity, dream.org, I think, leads the way in many ways, and living this inside and out. You mentioned earlier that you all are very intentional about working with justice impacted individuals. Why and how did that start? And why do you believe it's important for nonprofits and other organizations to really kind of rethink or prioritize working with the people that are impacted by the issues that they're working to solve?
Look, every nonprofit I have ever met has some analysis around racial injustice or economic injustice. That's usually the basis of the change we want to see. And if you're talking about any of those issues, you do not like, the best example of where those two intersect and where people are most impacted is in the criminal justice system. We have a real problem in terms of the statistics of how many people we incarcerate. We have just like 2.5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. I don't have the most up-to-date statistics, but that's just mind-blowing. Most prisoners in the world are here inside our country. Like, that's bananas in a country that's supposed to be based on freedom. And we know it's not just because we're addicted to incarceration, which we are for a million reasons. There's an economic and racial justice. This is what I believe. Not all my Republican partners believe it, but it's what I believe. And for me, then, if you want to change that, to change that system, to transform that system, there has to be opportunities before, so that people don't turn to crime as the only possible economic viable career path. And in a lot of communities, it really is. It's like the only one that can be seen, the only pathway out of poverty. We have to create opportunities ahead. And then we also have to create opportunities after. Most people incarcerated come home, but our system is so messed up that they come home worse instead of better. And then the ones that do perchance come home better, there's no opportunities. And I think the nonprofit sector is one place where you can say there is an opportunity. Every entry-level job, there is absolutely no reason not to invest in someone coming home to build up their abilities, even beyond entry level. Make that space so that we can change the economic outlook in the communities. And then the communities that folks come from, there is hope there. So I think I want every company, and we work with large, huge companies to transform and make sure they hire people coming home from prison. I think in a tight labor market, this is that's compelling. I can talk to companies about it forever of why this is where you need to look to source talent. But I think nonprofits, it's a no-brainer. Like, just do it. It's kind of living out your values. If you care about racial justice, economic justice, if you actually want companies to consider hiring folks coming home, like, walk the walk.
There's this notion of partnerships that's been an underlying current in what you've been saying throughout. And it's also been part of the initial spark for Match Nice. Our mission is to connect the nonprofit ecosystem to maximize impact. It's this idea that there are so many different people, leaders, organizations, communities working towards the same problem, solving the same problems, but sometimes the connection or the synchronization isn't quite there. So what if we could connect the dots between different mission aligned organizations and work more effectively together? Can you talk about how dream.org is embracing that in partnership with other nonprofit startups, leaders? Um, how do you see the role of partnerships being
Yeah.
important in the solutions?
For us, we have to make partnerships a priority. We have actual staff members dedicated to partnerships because we believe other people can do things better than we can, of course. Like, I don't need to build an entire data analysis function on my team. That's not going to be our strong suit. We're also not going to pay people that much. So who can we partner with, right, to do that better? I think partnerships make your life easier. But for us, our theory of change is that we cannot affect change unless we have strong relationships in every corner of power, which we define as, it's easy to see what our partnerships in DC and political power look like. But we're also quite serious about Wall Street and financial power, about Silicon Valley and that tech power of the future, about Hollywood and culture, and using influence and culture and making it beautiful is a big piece of how we think about our theory of change. So to partner in those sectors is critically important to us. But nonprofits, there's a few reasons why we have a hard time partnering with each other. I think one, there's this false sense of competition of resources.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got to prove that I do it better than you do it because then I won't get funding. And so there's a bit of that competition that's not necessary and unnatural. But I don't think that's the only thing stopping us from partnering. I think, quite honestly, we do not have the time because of this nonprofit. The way that we are set up is that the funding we get is that you have to deliver certain results, and partnership isn't usually in those results. So for me to tell anybody, hey, you need to do more social media when they're just trying to get meals out, on the ground, and that takes up all day. Or if I say you need better partnerships so that we can build this ecosystem and have a really nice fabric and come together, they don't have time. I feel like most coalitions I've been part of that fall apart, of course, there's like some nastiness that happens, but usually it's just time. That's not the thing we can dedicate our time to building the coalition. I feel like there is a lot of excitement. I think most people understand the necessity. I think there's some people that just want to fight, whatever. But for the most part, nonprofit people, we don't have time. We're getting paid very little to do a whole lot of work. And so for me, being very intentional, building it into the proposals, really building those relationships the same way you build your donor relationships is very important. It makes everything move faster. So if it's not a priority, a nonprofit is not going to be able to do it, no matter how much they know it's important.
Oh, yes, and many other reasons as well. Time constraints, certainly. There's risk, brand reputation, ego can get involved. There's a lot of obstacles to those partnerships, but I love what you kind of underscored is the intentionality, and that you can't be excellent at everything, and nor should you have to be. And partnerships can really play an important role within kind of completing that portfolio of services that you're looking to deliver to the communities that you're working with. Nisha, there's just a few more questions that I have for you, and you started answering this earlier as one of the lessons that you've learned kind of in your own social activist journey, and kind of like the fight the power, and kind of being a little bit more delicate with that. Now, maybe not delicate, but just more politically savvy. What what would you say over the last 30 years of your social activist journey? Um, what are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned? Like, if you could go back to yourself, and talk to that girl going to Catholic school and wearing the boys' uniform, or like on that trip to Thailand? Like, what are some of the things that you tell yourself?
I mean, I have kids that are, my son's going off to college next year. My daughter will be a sophomore in high school. And so part of it is I can see how the stuff I want to tell them, they're not going to listen to. You know, there's the wisdom that you only get from this point in your life, and there might be a reason. I remember someone telling me that college activism is always so terrible because by the time you know how to change something, you're out of college, right? Like they kind of build it that way so that like by the time you know what to do, you're out off that campus, which I think is funny. And there's a lot about that that's true about life. So for me, I would want to listen a lot more than I have. When I think about all the amazing people I met where I thought I knew, or I didn't just get curious and ask questions, I regret that. I think there are a lot of people I could have learned from had I had more of the open, I want to be a sponge, tell me everything. I see that in my son. It's like beautiful. He asks people, he'll sit, especially, elders, like you put him in a room with like the older Indian uncles, he'll just sit and listen and be curious. And I'm like, man, I wish I had had that. So that's one thing where I felt like I had to be right. And I can tell you all the reasons why I felt that way. There was very much like break the mold. I need to like really break the mold if I wasn't just going to be like a good Indian wife and be pretty and make tea and marry well. So there was definitely a part of that where I felt like I had to be really strong and loud. But man, the people I could have learned more from who aren't in my life anymore. That's what I wish I had gotten more experience. Yeah.
That's powerful listening. And it's also, I'm slightly surprised by you saying that, because it seems like such a critical skill in what you've been doing all along. But I can fully understand and see where you're coming from. A couple of additional questions, and then we'll wrap. Um, Coming back to thinking about the nonprofit landscape and the sector as a whole, part of this podcast has really been focused on trying to uncover some of the status quo practices that really could change, or need to change, or are being changed. What's one status quo practice in the nonprofit sector that you would like to see changed?
Oh, wow. Look, fundraising is always going to be the where my mind goes. I did a lot of my earliest work was just as a fundraiser and development director. It is hard work. Our development staff burn out a lot because year after year, you don't just have to renew the money you've gotten, you have to figure out how to replace and grow. And it is that entire department. I mean, the bigger you are, the more people are just there trying to prove, to foundations, donors, whoever it is, that, we do good work. It's hard. I don't know the solution. I've loved the trends of foundations just doing more general support and less project specific. I think having to have everything tied to a line item really hurts innovation, because then we have to do the thing we said we were going to do. It's hard to have the conversations about changing course, and therefore you can't innovate. And we're the ones on the field that know when something doesn't work and we just want to change it. And I wish that more foundations did that. You're doing great work. Here's general operating support. On the other hand, I wish development staff was more courageous in saying, like, this is what we're doing, and saying no to the money that puts you off course or makes you do stuff you know doesn't work. So really, I think getting the nonprofit sector to jump and embrace innovation and really start organizing foundations to say, we need money to innovate. We want to change the criminal justice system. We have 5 ideas about how we think it's going to happen next year. We're going to try those 5 and maybe more, and then move to the one that works the best. That we need to start organizing around. Otherwise, we're just going to be doing the same thing year after year and not be able to make those leaps and bounds and change that we want to make. So both sides of that fundraising picture, I think, could really change things for the nonprofit sector as a whole.
I love that. That's been a recurring theme that's come up on this show and in many conversations I've had is how beholden to funders nonprofits can become, the requirements, and how how nonprofits can become hamstrung from innovation because of those things, and just increasing trust within the fundraising space, and yes, the courage that's required to do that as well. Nisha, just one last question for you. What would you like your lasting legacy to be?
That is a really great question. I have said for a long time, like, I just want to lead a life of consequence. What that means to me now, having kids, is I want my lasting legacy to live on in them, for them to know it is possible, in one generation to completely change the trajectory for yourself and for the people around you. So yeah, I have big goals, right? Of course, I want to be known for a big piece of legislation that changes the world. Or I'd love if, we started figuring out how to come back together and not make politics so divisive. Of course, I want that to be my legacy. But really, when I think about it, like when you just asked me the question, my heart goes to my daughter and saying, I want my legacy to know that she is that vehicle for change and that we all are. And that's a very direct, she can live that. I hope that every generation after gets to live that too.
Well, you're an incredibly inspiring role model to, I think, everyone listening, to myself certainly, and no doubt your daughter as well and your family. So, Nisha, thank you for sharing your energy, your passion, your experience, the movement, the values, everything that you're doing to affect change. It's been an absolute privilege to have the opportunity to interview you, to learn from you, and to share this space with you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Cheers. Talk to you later. Were you as inspired as I was by that conversation? One of the coolest parts of our startup journey with Matchnice and the nonprofit lab has been the ability and the true privilege to meet, connect, and learn from inspiring and compassionate leaders like Nisha. If you haven't already, check out dream.org and consider contributing to their mission. And definitely check out Nisha's TED Talk titled The Radical Act of Choosing Common Ground, which we'll link in the episode description. Here's the quote to end our episode. This one from our guest today, Nisha Anand, who said, "The humanity that connects us must be stronger than what has been created to divide us." So good. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this and other episodes of the Nonprofit Lab, please consider taking a moment to follow, like, subscribe, rate, and share our podcast with other socially conscious leaders in your network. It would mean a lot to us. And as always, be well.